which is the whole point of this podcast. As previously discussed, up till 1982, the Internal Revenue Code and U.S. courts used the legality of the business expense, not the legality of the business itself, as the touchstone to determine tax deductibility. Remember, the United States Tax Court permitted individuals engaged in illegal drug trafficking to deduct ordinary and necessary business expenses as long as the expenses satisfied the interpretation of ordinary and necessary under Section 162, as the Supreme Court set out in 1966 in a huge case in the cannabis industry called Edmondson versus Comm'r. Now, in this case, the court allowed a drug dealer to deduct his business expense in relation to his drug trafficking business and construing the term necessary as imposing only the minimal requirement that the expense be appropriate and helpful for the taxpayer's business. Now, also, the court has a great quote in Commissioner versus Telier, also in 1966, construing the term necessary as imposing only the minimal requirement that the expense be appropriate and helpful to develop the taxpayer's business. Now, in direct response to Edmondson v. Comm'r, which was a case before the United States Tax Court in 1981, the drafters of the 1982 tax code parted ways with the 1969 code and turned the focus of deductibility to the legality of the business itself, not the source of the income. Now, breaking down the Edmondson versus Comm'r case, here the petitioner was a self-employed drug dealer. He sold cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines out of his apartment. The petitioner asserted his right under Section 162 to deduct business expenses, even though his enterprise was obviously illegal. Now, in the taxable year in question, the petitioner's business expenses included over $100,000 in cost of goods sold, around $800 in rent, roughly $200 in telephone calls, and $50 for a small scale. In this case, the tax court held that the petitioner was allowed to deduct those expenses because those are ordinary and necessary expenses for a business. Thus, the tax court continued the regular application of ordinary and necessary under 162, again, to only mean that was the business expense appropriate and helpful in developing his business? Now, after this opinion was published, Congress kind of freaked out. They wanted to prevent other drug traffickers from following suit. So Congress's Senate Finance Committee thought allowing drug dealers to benefit from business expense deductions while stealing billions of dollars per year from U.S. citizens was against the public's best interest. The committee urged that such deductions must be disallowed on public policy grounds. So as a result, Congress used, conveniently, the CSA's categorization system and enacted Section 280E as part of the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Tax Act of 1982. Section 280E is a tax law that denies the deduction of virtually every single business expense to businesses selling Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substances. Now, here I'm going to read you verbatim Section 280E. Here we go. Quote, "No deduction or credit shall be allowed for any amount paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business if such trade or business consists of trafficking in controlled substances, which is prohibited by federal law or the law of any state in which such trade or business is conducted." Now, with the enactment of Section 280E, if a taxpayer trafficked a Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substance, they lost virtually every ability to deduct any business expense under Section 182, except for costs of goods sold. On its face, Section 280E contradicts the original stated purpose of the code, which is to tax all income regardless of the legality of the business itself. Section 280E also stands in direct conflict with the drafter's intent to derive tax revenue from any source whatever. The Supreme Court and U.S. Tax Court used the drafter's intent as a foundation for determining deductibility from 1916 all the way up until 1982. Now, the decision to enact 280E hinged on Congress's primary goal to deter drug use, which contradicts, again, the drafter's intent not to change a man's moral character, which we discussed earlier in this podcast. Now, we have to think of the 80s and just what happened with Nixon and the war on drugs and Reagan's no-tolerance drug policies. Picture how crazy the United States was at this time. Now, the desired result of Section 280E was to burden drug traffickers when they filed federal income tax for their businesses by disallowing all business expense deductions of their illegal business. Now, in theory, this is what Congress thought. Theoretically, the drug trafficker would be overburdened by the lack of available deductions under 162 and eventually dissolve their illegal drug trafficking business. Congress actually didn't change Section 162 in any way. They just merely took the ability to deduct business expenses under 162 from drug dealers, except for cost of goods sold, which I will discuss later in this podcast. Now let's dive into the intent of Section 280E. The 1982 House report doesn't shed light on Congress's intent behind Section 280E, but the 1982 Senate report shows that Congress relied on public policy as the primary reason to add Section 280E into the tax code. The report noted Congress's dislike for drug dealing when it stated that drug dealers, quote, should not be afforded the benefit of business expense deductions. Congress believed there is sharply defined public policy against drug dealing. The Senate report also shows no indication that Congress tried to satisfy the public policy doctrine test set out by the Supreme Court, but the codification did align with the public policy doctrine. Now, reading the legislative history, I think it's reasonable to infer that Congress thought an exceptional circumstance existed, as the court defined in 1966. That is, by allowing drug dealers to deduct business expenses, frustrated sharply defined national policy, the Controlled Substances Act, and allowing these deductions were severe and immediate because the United States was fighting at this time a, quote, war on drugs, which, if you've read a few books or you've read a few articles online, we know the war on drugs, a lot of it was racially motivated. Now, Section 280E actually reaches further than Section 162 because 280E even disallows deductions for expenses that are not illegal per se. For example, salaries, rent, and telephone. Now, Section 280E disallows deductions to businesses who traffic Schedule 1 or 2 substances, regardless if the expense is illegal or not. In comparison, Section 162 only disallows deductions for illegal expenses. Section 280E reintroduced the inconsistency the 1969 Congress eliminated when they codified the public policy doctrine into Section 162. Remember, under the 1969 tax code, state legal cannabis business owners would be able to deduct all business expenses afforded to mainstream industries. Because business expenses in today's legal cannabis industry, they do meet ordinary and necessary under the Supreme Court's interpretation of 162. We know today legal cannabis businesses are essentially the same as any other mainstream business. They deduct ordinary and necessary expenses such as rent, payroll, and advertising. And to define business expense, all the court asks is the expense, quote, appropriate and helpful for the development of the taxpayer's business? Now, by denying virtually all business deductions to businesses who traffic Schedule 1 or 2 substances, that business must pay taxes on gross receipts compared to other legal or even illegal businesses that pay taxes on net income.